BioCentury This Week is brought to you by IQVIA Biotech. For biotech companies striving to bring innovative therapies to market and maximize patient impact, IQVIA Biotech is the trusted CRO of choice. Backed by 25 years of unparalleled experience and deep therapeutic expertise, our full-service clinical development solutions are purpose-built to accelerate success. IQVIA Biotech helps early-stage biotechs de-risk by developing strategic clinical development plans, guiding drug candidates along the most promising pathways. Leverage data-driven models and dynamic tools to craft a compelling value story, attract investment, and maintain momentum through every phase of drug development.
Welcome to a special edition of the BioCentury This Week podcast. I'm your host, executive editor here at BioCentury, Jeff Cranmer, and today we'll be taking a temperature check on the biopharma industry as it swings into the second half of 2025. It's not all bad. A handful of encouraging signals is cause for cautious optimism. Heading into the second half, companies have been able to parlay strong data into follow-on capital, and they've seen their stocks go up. That wasn't happening a year or two ago as the bear market grinded on. We've also seen some M&A activity picking up, a couple of takeouts in the UK recently. But of course, that said, the IPO window continues to remain firmly shut, and concerns about US drug pricing and FDA stability continue to weigh on expectations for a robust recovery for the sector in the near term. Joining us today, we'll have special guest Meg Hooton. She is president of IQVIA Biotech, and she is joining me and my colleagues Selena Koch, my fellow executive editor, and Lauren Martz, executive director of Biopharma Intelligence, to discuss key indicators of progress in the biopharma sector. Now, IQVIA Biotech sponsors BioCentury This Week. We're very grateful to them for that. IQVIA Biotech is a unit within the broader IQVIA that provides clinical development solutions to biotechs and emerging biopharma clients. Now, Meg will join us in a few minutes. First, I'd like to set the stage by bringing in Selena to recap some of the key takeaways from BioCentury's recently published 3Q Public Markets Preview. Selena, our colleague Stephen Hansen, spoke with a lot of buy-siders and some bankers earlier this summer and concluded that biotech is not yet ready for liftoff, at least in the US. You edited the piece. Why did he come to that conclusion?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so this is Stephen's analysis, but I'll see if I can at least do justice to the kind of key takeaways. Okay, so in the first half of the year, the reality was that biotech markets continued to underperform the broader markets, right? That was just the situation companies faced. But if you look at the second quarter specifically, these like the XBI, the major indexes were kind of mostly sideways, went up a tiny bit, but it was still an underperformance. There were, as you said at the top of this, positive readouts in the clinic, which is always a good thing. And share prices were being rewarded. Some companies are raising money on that. But, if the data is not like super obviously positive, right, you still might be punished for some ambiguity there. Fundraising that is not driven by a catalyst is still extremely rare. And I think some of the things that are still giving investors pause are, the big picture issues. The uncertainty at FDA was named by almost everybody, although it's just how worried they are about it varied a lot from person to person, but it was topic of conversation, all the conversations, right? Where the US is going to land on drug pricing, another big concern, kind of weighing down expectations. And then there's other factors that have been going on for a long time, the interest rate environment, so on and so forth. And so I don't think there was anybody who was confident that there was going to be a very robust recovery in the near term, right? But the optimistic part of it was more like the bottom had been reached. And then, there was a long drought. On the M&A front, there was a long drought in large deals, the kind of deal that can recycle a substantial amount of capital back to investors to then, redeploy into the sector. basically after JP Morgan through the end of April, there were no billion-dollar plus M&A deals, but that has since picked up, right? So that's a positive development.
Yeah, we've just seen one last week. Sanofi taking out Vice Bio for $1 billion and change. Verona was taken out for $10 billion. So bubbling up. Let's talk very quickly about the venture side of things. How are things looking for venture fundraisers?
Yeah, when we looked at first half venture across all series, across all biotech companies, the total raise fell in the first half of this year, year over year, compared to the first half of last year. And what fell even more was the number of rounds. We took it back to the first half of 2016. It was the least amount of venture rounds disclosed in that 10-year period because it wasn't the least amount raised. But what we were seeing is the average round size was going up. So that probably reflects the fact that investors are aware that investors need to keep their companies private for longer and finance them with longer runways, at least for those that they have most faith in. The overall activity was a bit lower.
Sounds good. Well, let's set aside regulatory and public policy. We've been talking about that on our regular podcast, and our Washington editor, Steve Usden, is keeping our readers up to speed. But the good news is that innovation continues to be strong. And I know we're going to have Meg on shortly, president of IQVIA Biotech, and she'll have some thoughts to share with us. But I just want to go through a couple of clinical highlights from the first half, and we may get to some milestones near the end of the podcast. It almost doesn't need to be said, but obesity remains front and center in the spotlight, in no small part to readouts for assets targeting amylin. Obesity frontrunners Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly had positive readouts for amylin programs. And of course, Metsera, one of the few bright spots in the IPO market, priced an IPO in January and traded up following its early clinical data from an amylin program. Beyond amylin, Scholar Rock, Regeneron had phase 2 wins for myostatin inhibitors. But let's look beyond obesity. Lauren, what readouts caught your eye?
Thanks, Jeff. One of the fields that we've been watching, which I think is really interesting because of the amount of attention this target has gotten over the years, is oral PCSK9 inhibitors. We saw positive phase 3 data from 2 trials for Merck's macrocyclic peptide, which is delivered orally. We also saw positive phase 2 data from a small molecule oral inhibitor from AstraZeneca. So these have different profiles. Merck's is most advanced, and I think it'll be really interesting to follow that and see what happens when one or both of these potentially reach the market with how they're used. As an oral peptide, there are issues with when you can dose it and things like that. And then I think another program with big market potential that everyone is following is the ivonescimab program from Akeso and Summit Therapeutics. This year so far, we've seen really highly anticipated phase 3 data from the first global phase 3 study for that program. I don't want to say they stumbled, but I think investors thought that those results were a stumble because they weren't necessarily as promising as expected. The trial met on progression-free survival and missed on overall survival. But we expect more data from that program. That's another one that we'll be watching.
Sounds good. Let's turn to some advanced therapies, as this is one of the other things we'll be talking to Meg Hooton about when we bring her on in just a few minutes. Obviously, the big news is Sarepta. Selena, we discussed this on Monday's pod. Can you quickly catch us up?
Right. Well, our colleague, Steve Usden, learned that a third patient had died in a trial of a Sarepta gene therapy. This one was for limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, and it's using the same vector as the 2 previously reported deaths in the Duchenne muscular dystrophy trial. So that has once again raised alarm bells about the safety and the future of AAV-based gene therapies. Those weren't the only deaths. Rocket Pharmaceuticals reported a patient died in a Danon disease gene therapy trial after systemic infection after some capillary leakage. So there's been some serious adverse events. At the same time, we saw Eli Lilly purchase a gene editing company, Verve Therapeutics, which is great for that modality. And Lauren, you had another one you wanted to bring up.
I think another bright spot in the advanced therapies field is the in vivo CAR T data. So this is, like a gene therapy, but to deliver CAR T cell effects. And we've now seen results from a very limited number of patients from 2 different groups that just look very promising.
Okay, Lauren and Selena, thank you for those updates. I'd like to bring in Meg now. Meg Hooton is president of IQVIA Biotech, and she is here to join this conversation about indicators of progress, hopefully, for the biopharma sector. I know we're all eager to put the bear market behind us. Meg, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jeff. Very pleased to be here.
Well, we're very glad to have you. Just want to maybe start off. I know one of the things that you spend a lot of time thinking about is emerging biopharma companies and their importance to biopharma as a whole. What state do you see them in now, and what are you thinking they need to do to get back on track?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks very much, Jeff. And what I might do is just start with a definition, and it's a generally accepted definition of what an emerging biopharma company actually is. And for our purposes today, they're defined as organizations that have less than an estimated 200 million R&D spend per year. Now, these EVP companies, as we refer to them, includes pre-commercial companies with no revenue, but it does also include smaller emerging companies with up to 500 million in annual revenue. So that's the sector I'm talking about today. And then coming back to your question about the significance of EVPs to biopharma as a whole, for me, there's sort of 3 key areas, and the EVPs really play a vital role in the biopharma ecosystem. They drive innovation in niche therapeutic areas and pioneer novel approaches to drug development, which you've already spoken about. But if we go through those in a little more detail, the innovation drive is really responsible for a large share of early stage innovation. That's really especially in areas like oncology, in rare diseases, and EVPs really dominate in cell and gene therapies in that sort of trial landscape. In addition to that, unlike larger companies, EVPs are often far more agile. They focus on specific therapeutic areas and have a really deep expertise in those therapeutic areas. They are strong pipeline contributors. If we look across the industry, EVPs are contributing significantly to global drug development pipelines. And, to sort of quote a statistic around that, if we looked at 2024, 63% of all trial starts occurred in this segment, which is even up on 2019 when it was only about 56%. They're increasing the share of early phase trials and over the past decade, and the EVPs have been substantially lifted by the growth in China-headquartered companies, which are disproportionately, EVP companies. The last 2 points I'll make is that, if we look at novel drug launches in 2024, sort of surprisingly, I guess, or not surprisingly because of the innovation, is that EVPs originated 85% of US drug launches in 2024. And as we spoke about earlier, EVPs are often licensing or partnering with larger firms for commercialization, although that's a little down year on year, 23 to 24, but we still see a fair swathe of that occurring as well.
Well, Meg, highlighting these EVPs and, their importance in trial starts, what are you seeing in terms of phase 2 success rates for companies like this? Where do they stand?
Yeah, look, I think we recognise that improvements in clinical development decision-making, processes, technology deployment are really critical, particularly in the phase 2 space. Pharmaceutical research and development is highly risky. I don't need to tell anyone that. And, we know that the phase 2 success rates have really been quite stubborn and hovered around the 30% in recent years. At the total industry level. What that drives is higher clinical development costs, and it adds time to the drug development pathway. So, it's taking about 13 years currently from a patent filing to patient availability, of being able to access new medicines. And so that's still an extraordinarily long time. So I think, what can we do in phase 2? It's really a lot more efforts to improve the decision-making process. If we're going to fail fast and move on then to the next asset, looking at our processes so that we can get to the top line results on a phase 2 sooner rather than later, make a go, no-go decision based on that. Using technology, so deploying technology will help us increase the average phase 2 success rates, molecule selection, conduct of the clinical trial, for example. And technology deployment may be reflecting an increase in the average phase 2 success rates for industry-sponsored and interventional trials. And we hope, we can take that from about 30% success rate up to 35%, through the remainder of 2025. And I think that would make a really positive inflection point for this sector.
So Meg, when you just outlined a bunch of kind of high-level things that could improve success rates, failing faster, better decision-making, deployment of technologies. Can you give some more specific examples around each of them, or is there one of those areas where you think more progress might be just around the corner than another one?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it comes down to asset selection, doing the modelling, looking at the phase 1 data to make sure that the assets that are progressing into phase 2 are the right assets. In addition to that, it's the design of the clinical trial to achieve the appropriate endpoints to progress the asset through to phase 3. I don't think it's any one thing in particular. It's a combination of factors that I see it makes phase 2 trials successful, but there is a large dropout rate. And, it's a bit like a pyramid. We start with a large base in phase 1. Attrition occurs at each phase of the clinical trial, and that can be right up through to phase 3. But that probably doesn't give you a specific example.
Does AI have a role to play?
Yes, I think AI does have a very big role to play. And, as an organisation, for the broader IQVIA, we're definitely looking at the application of AI and generative AI across the clinical development landscape. And I think where I've seen AI used very successfully is in smarter trial design. So really optimising protocols for number one, using AI to determine the best sites to conduct the clinical trials, using historical data and then predictive modelling. I think faster recruitment, we can use AI to identify eligible patients for trials, using real-world data, natural language processing to identify eligible patients for electronic medical records and registries as well. And in addition to that, we can use AI to drive retention for very long, protracted studies and those digital engagement tools that resonate with particularly, with the younger patient population. And then I think lastly, AI really helps with better monitoring and an analysis for the conduct of the clinical development programs. It enables us to do remote monitoring, early detection of safety issues, picking up those early signals. And it definitely speeds up data analysis and natural language processing as well. So I think there's a huge amount of applications. And I think collectively across the industry, we're all examining this very closely. And I think there's a huge amount of opportunity, and we're just at the beginning of that journey.
That'd be a topic for a future analysis from you all over there. Among those things, where is AI having the most impact right now?
Yeah, thanks. So IQVIA Biotech sees the huge amount of opportunity with artificial intelligence, and the broader IQVIA organisation has many initiatives underway at the moment. We are examining use cases, starting at the outset, looking at the use cases we can apply to clinical trials and then building on those. So it's basic functionality at the moment, but that will be through to building customised agents that can help us with the clinical development process. We're not quite there yet. More to follow there.
Excellent. Well, look forward to seeing that when you have it. Well, we talked a little bit about advanced modalities such as gene and cell therapy up at the top. I know, Meg, one of the things that you've been thinking about are the barriers to access for some of these advanced modalities. And I'm curious what you're seeing and And where does the change need to come from so that patients have better access to these assets?
And it's an important question because of the prevalence of these advanced modalities. If we look at industry-sponsored cell and gene therapy clinical trials, they've more than tripled over the last decade, and much of that is attributed to CAR T therapies, and we certainly do a lot of CAR T therapy work ourselves. The research has also focused on different types of gene therapies. That includes gene editing as well. A total of 76 cell and gene therapies have launched globally at the end of 2023, including 20 launches in the prior years. So it is a really important area that we need to take note of. The barriers to access there, access remains limited to patients for these novel advanced therapies. In part, it's due to delays and limitations from reimbursement from payers. And in part, it's due to the complexity of the manufacturing process and the delivery of these treatments. It's not as simple as pulling a drug off a shelf, putting a label on it and giving it to the patient, far more complex than that. So for CAR T cell therapies, the patient treatment rates significantly vary across countries globally, from 25% of referred patients receiving treatment in a country like Brazil, for example, whereas if we look at Italy, that's up around the 70% mark. The most common reasons that individuals don't receive treatment for disease is really related to disease progression and fitness for treatment. That fitness often declines over time as patients progress through that sort of a very long treatment journey as well. So I think the limited use of these advanced therapies, it brings a fair degree of uncertainty to the life sciences sector, and we need ongoing investment in this area, both with reimbursement and development of new products.
All right. Well, Meg, thank you so much for that. Meg Hooton, president of IQVIA Biotech, joining us on the BioCentury This Week podcast. Meg, appreciate you joining us.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much, Jeff. It's been great.
Excellent. And out now is an insight brief from IQVIA Biotech, turning vision into venture capital. You can find it at IQVIAbiotech.com. We're going to take a short break and we'll be back after that.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the 12th China Healthcare Summit in Shanghai. From in-licensing to new co's, cross-border deals from Asia are transforming global biopharma. Meet top decision makers and investors at the 12th China Healthcare Summit to explore emerging opportunities and tackle key challenges in this rapidly evolving landscape. Join us in Shanghai October 22nd to 24th to get a first-hand look at China's dynamic life sciences ecosystem. Register and learn more at biocenturychinasummit.com.
We're back on the BioCentury This Week podcast. Well, gene and cell therapy, I'd like to continue the conversation a little bit more on these barriers to access. It's something that we think a lot about here at BioCentury. Selena, Lauren, who wants to start?
Sure, I can jump in, Jeff. So a few years ago, there was this, I would say, burst of enthusiasm around gene therapies, right? Because we had a bunch of approvals. There was the sickle cell disease gene therapy from Vertex. There were hemophilia gene therapies. And it was a sense of like, okay, the development and regulatory path, the field is figuring it out, right? Now they just have to perform on the market. And they haven't really performed on the market. And not very many patients have gotten them, even though what they offer is the possibility of like a functional cure. And so that's the problem. And there's not one factor, but several. When you're talking about the hemophilia gene therapies, these are kind of off the shelf in a sense, in vivo therapies. So they don't have the manufacturing complexity issue autologous CAR Ts, but they have marketed therapies that patients can take, chronic treatment with factors that for some patients, for many patients, work pretty well and might seem easier or less scary or something. So that's one issue. When you're talking about the CAR Ts, it's not only is there complex manufacturing, but the commercial model is kind of analogous to transplant therapies, right? Where you have to have these payer-approved accreditations at a site. And so you end up with very few sites that can really pull this off. And so there's a whole constellation of factors that show up and kind of for different reasons hold up these different gene therapies. And then layering on top of that, of course, what we started with on the top of this is the new safety risks for the AAV gene therapies, kind of potentially scaring investors away. Again, it was already a tough sell for investors because of the commercial problems, right? But I have to hope that there will be some technology solutions, at least, to some of the safety issues or other issues holding back gene therapies that could make a big difference and might get some funding. So I don't know. I think Lauren could weigh in here on what would make a difference from a technology perspective. What's coming down the line?
Let me just first comment on one thing. You mentioned that the sites that can be used to deliver CAR T cells are a barrier to access. I think a promising development is that barrier is coming down with the removal of the REMS from the autologous CAR T cells in the US, which takes away some of the hurdles with getting that modality to patients. I think we talked a little bit about in vivo CAR Ts before, and I think that there are different technologies for the cell therapy field that would really make a difference. We're seeing CAR T cell therapies expand beyond cancer to indications where there's maybe less tolerance for the amount of risk that this modality brings. The autoimmune diseases are the big example. And there's not a lot of tolerance for the amount of conditioning, the chemotherapies that patients get before they even get the CAR T, because this is actually very dangerous. So novel conditioning regimens are something that I think could make a big difference and could make these cell therapies, make more patients with different diseases potentially qualify for these cell therapies, bring the associated risks down. And then, as we talked about before, in vivo CAR Ts just completely eliminate a lot of that manufacturing complexity, even beyond what you would get from an off-the-shelf cell therapy. This is just a viral vector. It's produced, it's not an AAV. Oftentimes, it's a lentivirus or an LNP that delivers mRNA. But, this manufacturing is much, much less complex, less patient-specific when we're talking about in vivo CAR T. So that would be a huge access advantage. For AAV gene therapies, I think there are a lot of issues that contribute to the safety problems. But what we're seeing now, what's on everyone's mind, is the liver toxicity. This has made it really difficult to deliver an AAV gene therapy outside of the liver or to larger patients or to patients who have any kind of, damage to their liver or pathology related to the liver. There's a lot of work happening to try to detarget different capsids from the liver, which is not a trivial task. There is a lot of work going on to create novel capsids that better target other tissues, the muscle, for example. I don't think that we've seen much evidence in the clinic yet that any of this will make a very big difference on the amount of these viral vectors that does end up getting to the liver and causing an inflammatory reaction there. But I think that delivery aspect is the big one for AAV gene therapies.
Lauren, great points there. Obviously something you'll be following for us here at BioCentury. Wanted to thank IQVIA Biotech and Meg Hooton, the president of IQVIA Biotech, for coming on the show. Selena, just curious, any points that Meg made that resonated with you?
Well, I really thought her comments on the kind of use cases for AI were pretty spot on because we hear those a lot from the companies that we talk to as well. Finding the best trial sites and identifying patients, obviously recruitment. We hear it over and over. It is one of the big sources for delays, right? And a big issue across the industry. And so that's one, I think that is making some progress already. But, she brought up a variety of things there that were pretty interesting.
Excellent. Once again, thanks to IQVIA Biotech for sponsoring BioCentury this week. We will return, of course, next Monday with the regular edition of the BioCentury This Week podcast. And a special thanks to Kendall Square Orchestra, which provides the music for all of BioCentury's podcasts.
BioCentury would like to thank IQVIA Biotech for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. To learn more about how IQVIA Biotech can help you turn your vision into venture capital, go to IQVIAbiotech.com/visionaries.